Welcome to the Forge, my wanton wildlings. I'm your creepsmith, and I hope you like my work. One of the comforts that we've found in our human existence is our ability to rationalize. As long as we can observe and analyze, we can put together a reason, or at least an attempt at one that makes some sense of something that confuses us. If we can make sense of something, that makes us just a little less powerless, a little less scared. But what about those things that simply are, that serve no rationale or reason? Those are maybe the scariest things. Like tonight's denizen of the demented, the gardener, by Manen Lyset. When you live in the desolate countryside, you tend to come across a lot of strange and unexplainable things. The strangest that I've seen is an entity that I've come to refer to as the gardener. Now don't let his innocent nickname fool you. He is by far the most terrifying individual to inhabit the valley that I call home. It's partially because of his brazen behavior. While some creatures lurk in the woods behind the fields and scamper away at the first sign of human life, the gardener roams in full view, carrying his rusty watering can everywhere he goes. He's so brazen, in fact, that I originally thought that he was a senile neighbor. That is, until the night I saw him up close. That's when I realized that he wasn't human. He was something more, or perhaps something less. This year, the region was experiencing a prolonged period of drought, the third in recent memory, in fact. My land, once full of rich soil, was crumbling at my feet, dry and cracked like the surface of a shortbread cookie. You would think nothing could survive in the desert-like conditions, yet weeds spread like wildfire over what had once been a luscious field of strawberries. They formed a mismatched blanket of gnarled vegetation that extended from my house to the neighbor's farm several miles away. He'd given up the upkeep several months ago and allowed his land to be swallowed away, while I stubbornly spent my days pulling out the weeds and mowing my field, to no avail. Every morning I'd wake up to an ocean of undesirable plant life replacing what I had got rid of the day before. A few nights ago I spotted someone in my field. My eyes attempted to pierce through the darkness so that I could make out the form more clearly, but all I could see was the outline of the man slowly making his way up and down my rows of barren land. From his short gait and hunched stance, he gave the impression of being an elderly man. My first thought was that he was a disoriented neighbor in need of help, so I hurried out with a flashlight to offer my assistance. However, by the time I made it out the door, he was gone. Try as I might, I could not find a single trace of him. He left no footprints to prove his existence, nor did he produce any sound nearby that could point me in the right direction. I wondered then, as I stood alone with nothing but the howling wind to keep me company, if he'd just been a figment of my imagination. Isolation can play tricks on the mind. It was probably just an animal, I theorized. As I headed back home, I felt my feet sinking in the ground. I knelt down and touched the soil with the back of my hand. It was moist, as though freshly watered. It had not been my imagination. This was my first encounter with the gardener. The next morning I awoke to find half my field covered in thick and twisted vines. They stretched from the woods all the way to where I had last seen the gardener the night before. A coincidence, I thought. The weeds stopped abruptly, and the transition between them and the empty land was so unnaturally well defined that it resembled the sharp walls of a corn maze. I was in for another day of hard labor, else I risked my home being overrun by the tangled mess. I decided to go into town to buy some herbicide and some fuel for my lawnmower. It had been a while since my last visit, and honestly, I needed the human interaction. There was talk of an exodus in town that day. The region couldn't survive another poor harvest, and apparently many families had abandoned their homes seemingly overnight. Those houses were soon swallowed by the same weeds that I'd been battling all summer. As I did the rounds and made my purchases, I couldn't help but wonder if it was time for me to move on as well. I liked my home. I loved living in the countryside, but the valley was dying. Maybe my troubles were a sign that it was time to leave. Once I'd finished my errands, I drove back home, where I spent the rest of the day spraying, mowing, and pulling the weeds from my field. The gardener appeared again that night as I sat on the porch rewarding myself with a beer. He didn't even seem to mind my presence as he walked about slowly, stopping every few meters to dip a watering can. He did so seemingly at random, pouring a substantial amount of liquid into my wasteland of a field. I watched, stunned, as he continued, row after row, emptying the canister onto the cracked soil. I didn't think there was anything else at play here other than a crazy old coot with a pathological need to water invisible plants. Perhaps he had Alzheimer's and mistook my field for his garden. I could have run up to him and asked him to stop, but I honestly didn't see the point in bothering the old soul. Without so much as a wave of acknowledgement, I left him to his own devices and headed inside. For hours, I laid in bed, unable to find sleep, partially due to the dry heat and partially due to a building sense of anxiety in the pit of my stomach. There was one thing that nagged at me, though. I'd watched the man water the ground for a good 10 to 20 minutes. Never once did I see him refill his canister. Just how much water could a thing like that hold? I'm not sure what compelled me to do it, but I crawled out of bed and drew open the blinds of my bedroom window. The old man was still going at it, his back turned to me no more than 10 meters from my house. I could see him quite clearly this time. Gray and white hairs stuck out from underneath a straw hat. Skinny arms and bony hands clutched his rusty watering can. A flannel plaid shirt was tucked into a pair of overalls, and rubber boots, not unlike those of a cranberry farmer, reached midway up his legs. The scene went from slightly odd to downright strange when I noticed a twig sprouting from the spot that he had just watered. Before my very eyes, more and more weeds were emerging from my field like baby chicks hatching from their eggs. They blanketed my property in a matter of seconds. In utter disbelief, I closed the curtains and backed away. Impossible, I thought. It had to be a trick. Maybe I just had too much to drink. Perhaps the second beer, combined with my exhaustion and the dehydration from a hard day's work, had conspired against me to create this unearthly illusion. Even though I'd seen the result of the weed's unnatural growth throughout the week, it was hard to resign myself to the truth. My mind was plagued with denial. I crept back into bed, though the only way I'd get any sleep was by casting aside my thoughts of the strange old man and his plants that grew as quickly as magic beanstalks. Even still, it took several hours for sleep to finally find me. Not even the welcoming rays of sun could wake me the next morning. By the time I opened my eyes, it was almost noon. My back ached from the previous day's activities of lugging around the large herbicide container and bending over to pull the weeds. It had taken a toll on my body, but it was nothing that I wasn't used to. Having grown up on a farm, I'd become accustomed to hard labor and the soreness that came with it. Down the creaky wooden stairs I went, and then turned the corner to my kitchen. That's when I saw what had become of my beloved field, and the sight caused me to gasp loudly. There were weeds from corner to corner. They stretched up a good 6 feet and then buckled and craned downwards. I'd woken up to a carpet of weeds before, but never this high or this dense. It shocked me to the point of immobility. I must have stood there studying the sight in shock for a good 10 minutes before I finally managed to move a muscle. What could I do but cut them down again? They were too tall for my lawnmower, so I equipped myself with a sickle and more herbicide, tackling the vines blindly. Not only did they stretch from the forest all the way across my field, but they also crawled along the exterior walls of my house. Within hours, I had filled 5 garbage bags full of vines, but had only managed to clear a fraction of my land. I was beyond drained by nightfall, having spent the entire day trying to free my property from the clutches of unwanted vegetation. The sun had set by the time I returned home for a meal. A combination of the scent of herbicide and sweat were imbued into my clothes, but I ignored it in favor of filling my growling stomach. Echoing in the back of my head, I could still hear the sound of my sickle ripping through the thick weeds, and I could feel my arms tugging at the roots. I had barely managed it, but I had cleared the majority of the undesirable plant life. A warm shower and a good meal later, I took a seat on the old rocking chair by the window. As I did, I had the vague impression that the weeds were already reclaiming my lot. This was unacceptable. I was going to have to wage war on them, and I couldn't allow them to get a foothold again. This was ending tonight. I'd stay up until the brink of dawn if it meant eradicating every single twig, vine, and bush that didn't belong on my property. I grabbed a flashlight and my sickle before exiting my house. Sheer, stubborn determination was the only thing keeping my tired body from toppling over. I did my best to clear the bushes plaguing my land, but it seemed as though every time I finished one spot and moved to the next, the roots grew back. If that wasn't bad enough, the gardener had arrived for his nightly rounds. I saw him gliding through the tangled mess with ease. The vegetation seemed to clear a path for him, only to close as soon as he'd made it through. I'd never been one to scare easily, and especially not when faced with something as harmless as an elderly man. But something in my guts told me to run and hide. A deep, primal part of me begged me to escape. Where could I go but the very forest of weeds that I was trying to clear? I rolled under the thorny mess and ducked low to the ground to spy on the gardener. From my lower vantage point in close proximity, I could see the bottomless watering can the gardener carried. It looked surprisingly normal. It was pastel green, though half its paint had been chipped off, exposing a rusted undercoating. On its sides were faded prints of what I could only assume were roses. Yet that did not seem to deter the flow of water in the least. Holding the watering can were fingers almost as thin and sharp as twigs. One would have expected them to be shaky, yet they held on firmly, without so much as a hint of weakness. In the shadows, I crawled closer to the old man while he continued his work. I decided that it was time to confront him, ignoring the warning bells resonating in my mind. What was I so afraid of? I was bigger, tougher, and faster. He was just an old man. Taking my courage in hand, I revealed myself and stood directly in front of the stranger. That was the biggest mistake of my life. I understood, as I stood face to face with the gardener, that he was not human. Under the man's handmade straw hat was a face so horrible it caused me to tremble. I'm not sure what it was that I noticed first, the eyes or the mouth. His lips were sewn together like that of a scarecrow. A raggedy twine kept them perpetually angled downwards, while his jaw and cheeks moved in what I could only assume was an attempt at speaking, but no sound left his restrained maw. His eyes, or rather his eye sockets, were empty. The red, moist walls contracted steadily with every beat of his heart. His lower eyelids were folded out and drooped down to his sharp cheekbones, exposing veins and pink flesh. The sight made me stumble back and scream. Perhaps I startled the gardener, or perhaps he intended to do so all along, but as soon as he heard me yell, he lunged forward and swung the watering can towards my face. Instinctively, I threw up my arms to protect myself and felt lukewarm liquid sprinkle onto my left arm. It was water. Just water. If nothing else, it was nice and refreshing. It was like walking through a sprinkler in the middle of a blisteringly hot summer day. My arms fell back in place, and only then did I realize that the gardener was gone, leaving behind no trace except for the soil that he'd watered. I had tested my luck enough for one night, I thought. The day's events had finally caught up to me, and an overwhelming need to sleep forced me to stumble towards my house in a tired haze. The only light that I could see for several miles was the one on my porch, guiding me back like a landing strip at an airport. I can't even remember making it to bed, but somehow I managed. Pain. Searing, burning pain in my arm pulled me from my slumber. I woke up in absolute agony. It was nothing like the muscle soreness that I was used to. The sensation was as though someone had run a rake over my bones and shot pine needles through each of my pores. I threw my blanket off and looked at my now trembling left arm. The skin on it was drier than a desert, resembling the cracked and arid land outside. There was a strange green welt on my forearm, like a tiny volcano begging to erupt. The veins on my arm had turned forest green as well. What exactly had I been exposed to? Was it an allergic reaction to the weeds that I'd been rolling around in, or was the gardener somehow to blame? Instinct took over, and I stumbled to the washroom, throwing open every drawer and cupboard until I found a pair of tweezers. I wanted relief from the pressure building on the inside of the welt. I was barely able to keep hold of the tweezers due to the pain, but I forced my fingers to hang on long enough to reach the pustule. I squeezed, and it gushed open. Instant relief. I sat on the edge of my bathtub, eyes closed as green liquid oozed out of the bizarre welt. For a few blissful moments the pain in my arm stopped, but then I felt something deeper under the skin. I opened my eyes just in time to see a tiny weed sprout out from the now open sore. It unfurled and grew about an inch in height. The plant's roots did what came naturally to them. They headed towards the nearest source of hydration, and the closest thing this sapling had to a water source was the blood flowing through my veins. I felt a sharp prickle as its roots pierced into my circulatory system and traveled through me. The sensation was violating, and I could feel each grainy branch stretching my veins to their limit. Something needed to be done, and fast. There were only two things that I could think of to get rid of the weed: my lawnmower or the herbicide. Obviously, I wasn't about to run my arm under the blades of a lawnmower. Holding my arm tightly, I dashed out to the garage where I found the nearly empty jug of herbicide. In my desperation, I poured it over the exposed skin, and I'm not sure what hurt more, the plant spreading through my system or the poison. The chemicals boiled at the surface of the wound, causing the sapling to shrivel up and die, but they also burned my skin in the process. My pain receptors were overloading from the relentless agony that I was putting myself through. I groaned guttural, animalistic noises, barely able to breathe. I knew what had to be done next. I had killed the weed, but it was still inside me. It still needed to be removed. It took me a few minutes to convince myself to do it. Herbicide and green blood drizzled down my arm as I grabbed an old rag from the shelf. I rolled it and wedged it between my teeth, filling my mouth with the unpleasant taste of dirt and grime. The feel of the fabric scratching against my teeth brought goosebumps to my skin, but the discomfort was mild compared to what I was about to endure. With a deep inhale, I wrapped my fingers around the sapling, closed my eyes tightly, and pulled. If not for the gag, my screams would have likely echoed all the way to town. The sensation was nauseating. I could feel every twisted knot and tendril scraping the walls of my veins. The pain radiated from my forearm, reaching the tips of my fingers and all the way to my clavicle. Tears streamed down my sweat-stained face as I continued to pull until I'd gotten every last inch of the roots out of me. Finally, I dropped the plant onto the ground and examined what had just been inside my body. It was longer than I could have ever imagined, and it spread into smaller branches, most of which had small bulbs at the end. Had I not dealt with it swiftly, I have no doubt those bulbs would have ruptured my skin and spread, overtaking me quickly. And then everything went black. When I came to, I found myself curled up in a ball on the cold cement floor. My left arm could barely move. I pushed myself to my feet, dizzily heading to the bathroom so I could wash the mess. As I looked into the mirror, however, I realized the green veins had spread from my arm to the rest of my body, and now my face was covered in pustules. I had lost. It's night now, and the gardener is out there again. He's wandering my field, watering the cracked and dried up soil. I expect my house to become buried under a sea of weeds by morning, and there's nothing I can do about it. The pustules are growing larger by the hour, the saplings inside getting ready to burst out. My only hope now is to drink what's left of the herbicide. I wonder what'll die first, me or the weeds. So yes, sometimes there are those things that need no reason. They simply are as they are, and they simply do what they do. And if you get too close, they'll do it to you. Stay scary, wildlings. Don't step up if you're not ready for the consequences, and make the most of your nights.